Um, Welcome to Wordpath, the show about Oklahoma Indian languages. My topic tonight is kin terms, that is, words that we use for people that are related to us. You often hear someone say something like, "He's my uncle" in the Indian way. We'll try to see what statements like that mean, and if there is just one Indian way, or, as you might suspect, many. Now, you might ask, why is it important to study kin terms? For one thing, it's a very complex area and there is a lot of variation, so anthropologists and some linguists are very interested in this topic. I should say right up front, I'm not a specialist in this area. I never really took a course. You can take a whole course in kinship systems, and I haven't done that. I've just done a little reading, and I've picked up a little bit of information by studying a number of different Oklahoma Indian languages. I think enough to give you some of the flavor of what kind of variation happened and how interesting it really is. So it's important because kinship exists in all human societies, so it's something we can compare across societies around the globe. And the kind of classification systems, this is a type of classification system, those kind of systems that are reflected in the kinship vocabulary vary strikingly from language to language, believe it or not. There are lots of differences, and they bear relation to the usefulness of the terms and the categorization of relationships in the society. So it's another one of these areas where the language and the culture and the society are all interrelated. And so it's of crucial importance, if you want to really speak the language well and use the right kinship terms at the right time, to understand the cultural and social organization behind it. Now let me just give you a few examples. These are from Crystal's Encyclopedia of Linguistics, one of my favorite sources for just a little smattering of information about various topics. Here's some of the things that he says about kinship systems, just a few snippets from languages around the world. He says that Hungarian had no terms for brother or sister until the 19th century, but it did have separate terms for older brother and older sister and younger sister. There are a number of other languages like that, by the way. He also mentioned that Swedish has no single term for grandmother and grandfather. There are four different terms, and they're very transparent. Even if you don't speak Swedish, it's related to English, and I think you'll catch on. Your father's father is called farfar. Your mother's father is called morfar. Your father's mother is farmor, and your mother's mother is mormor. So you can see it's just different combinations of the word mother and father to find out whether it's your mother's or father's mother or father. They don't have any single cover term for grandmother or for grandfather or for all of them. Another point he mentions is that Latin used to distinguish various types of uncle. Now, most of you probably know, or if you've been watching our show, you've learned that Latin is sort of the great-grandparent language of the whole family that's now called the Romance language family, which includes French, Spanish, Portuguese, Catalan, and some other languages. So it's interesting that Latin used to make more distinctions than those daughter languages, as they are called, make today. Latin used to distinguish your father's brother, which was patruus, from your father's sister, which was matertem, according to the book. That doesn't sound very Latin to me, but I'm just quoting you. And then your mother's brother was avunculus, or avunculus, depending on which dialect of Latin you speak. Your mother's sister was amita. So modern Romance languages have reduced all these four terms down to just two, which are, interestingly, derived from the mother's brother and sister terms. So you have, for instance, in French, oncle for both of your uncles and tante for both of your aunts or aunts. Here's another interesting thing. Well, this is further about uncles, and uncles are very interesting in kinship systems. In English, he points out in another section, there's no single word for your mother's brother, your father's brother, your mother's sister, and so forth. So we have aunts and uncles, but there's no cover term. It's just a fact about English. There could be just one term. For instance, we have a term like grandparent, which covers all four grandparents, but we don't have a cover term for all the uncles and aunts. Now, in Pichanjajara, I believe it's pronounced, which is a language of Australia, your mother's sister is called, I won't try to pronounce this, by a certain term, which also is the term for mother. Your mother's brother is called by a certain term. Your father's sister is called by a certain term. And your father's brother is called by a certain term, which also means father. So it seems like father and aunts and uncles are kind of mixed up here. We'll see more examples of that later tonight. At any rate, the meaning of these, what you might call father terms, will differ according to according to who is called father in the culture and what it means to be a father in that society. So, for instance, in a society where your father's brothers bear some of the responsibility of parenthood in your family, of fatherhood, so to speak, it might very well be that in that culture your father's brothers are called fathers as well. There are languages like that, and we'll see a couple of examples tonight. Now, anthropologists have worked out technical names for these different types of systems because the languages of the world don't vary infinitely. They tend to group themselves into certain ways of categorizing kinship terms. The system that English belongs to is called the Eskimo type, and it's a rather unusual system. Other systems include what's called the Crow system, which apparently tends to coordinate with matrilineal societies. Then there's the Omaha type system, which tends to correlate, I guess correlate's the word I want, with patrilineal societies. And then there's something called the Iroquoian type, and there probably are others. These are ones that I've heard of. Now, in many societies which have the Iroquois type systems, the word father, or a word that can mean father, is applied also to one's father and to one's father's brothers and male cousins as well. In societies with Crow type systems, a word that means father also applies to, besides one's father, as we think of father in English, applies to the father's brothers, the father's sister's sons, the father's sister's daughter's sons, and sometimes to the father's mother's brothers as well. If this is making your head spin, that's just kind of how I feel about kinship, but I think it's very, very interesting. It takes a while to wrap your brain around some of these concepts, though. I've got charts when we start talking about some Oklahoma Indian languages that may be helpful. But let me just mention one more thing that comes up in many languages of Oklahoma, which is that there are two factors which figure into a lot of systems in languages other than English, including some Indian languages, in a different way than they do in English. One is gender, so that you may call an uncle by a different term depending on whether it's through your female relative or your male relative. Or you may call someone by a different term depending on whether you are female or male. And another factor that comes in a different way than in English is the age of relatives. So there are lots of languages which have specialized terms for older brother versus younger brother, and this extends into other areas of the terminology as well. So let's look at some examples from Oklahoma Indian languages. Let's start with Comanche. This is one of the languages that I'm most familiar with, but I don't know all of the kin terms even in Comanche. I haven't really made a specific study of this, but let me show you a few interesting things about it. And I have to explain a little bit about this charting system. People who make a study of kinship usually use some kind of diagramming technique like this as a kind of shorthand for what kind of relationships we're talking about. Let me explain briefly. You see that all of these different points on the end of these branches have either a triangle or a circle next to them. The circle, like in this one for an older sister, the circle is representing a female relative and the triangle a male. So all the triangles on here are male people and all the circles are females. And in addition, this one that usually you see somewhere in the center that's filled in with black represents what anthropologists call ego. In other words, that's the self with respect to which all of these other terms are being defined. So that says, for instance, let's say I'm a woman and I have these brothers and sisters. As you go across here, these are people in your same generation, such as brothers and sisters. Let's say I'm a woman who marries a man. The double line connection here means a marriage as opposed to a blood relationship. So this is let's say me, I'm a woman, I marry a man, I have brothers and sisters here, I have a son and a daughter. I have, if we go up a generation, all of these brothers and sisters are descended from this marriage, so this is my father and my mother. They have brothers and sisters who we think of as uncles and aunts in English on both sides. And then those whole families, that generation has parents. This would be my grandfather and my grandmother and my other grandfather and grandmother. And then you can go up another generation to your great-grandparents. So that's kind of how this symbolism works. Now let's look at some of the actual terms in Comanche. Let's say I am a woman and I've used the convention here, and I don't know how standard this is, of putting the older relatives on the left and you go down in age moving to the right. So let's say I'm a woman and I have an older sister. She would be called Napatsi. Patsi means older sister or elder sister. If I have an elder brother, that's Napavi. A younger sister would be Nami. So Patsi and Nami are two different terms for sister. There's no cover term that just means my sister. You have to specify whether it's the older one or the younger one in Comanche. If I have a younger brother, that's Natami. Not the same as Pavi, my older brother, but Tami, my younger brother. And there's no generic term for brother. You have to specify whether it's your older or younger brother you're talking about. Quite a few languages work this way. Now let's go up in the generations. So here I am with my brothers and sisters. I and they are the offspring of my parents. My male parent is Naapa, my father, and Pia is my mother. My father has, let's say, a brother and a sister. The sister, who we call aunt or aunt in English, is Napaha in Comanche. The little n I put on sometimes just means my, because usually you don't use a kin term without saying whose relation it is. So you just say Napaha, Naara, Naapa, and so forth. Okay, Napaha is my aunt. Doesn't matter in Comanche whether it's my aunt on my father's side or my mother's side. They're both called Paha, if you'll notice. My uncle, that is my father's brother, or my mother's brother of any age, older or younger, as long as it's a brother of either parent, is going to be called Naara. Ara is uncle. Now, you'll notice that some of the terms on this chart are underlined in red, and that's to draw your attention to a special and interesting feature of Comanche, which is that there are a number of terms, more so in Comanche than in English and in many languages, a number of terms which are reciprocals is the term I've used for them. So all the reciprocal terms are underlined in red, and what this means, for instance, is here I am a woman, the ego here. This is my father's sister, so I call her Paha, which means aunt. She also calls me Paha, which means niece. Here I am a woman. I have my mother and, say, her brother. I call him Ara. He calls me Ara right back. It's completely reciprocal. It's a two-way relationship. It seems to me to imply a sort of a mutuality there that we don't get from the English language versions, at least, because we have completely different terms, aunt and niece, whereas in Comanche it's Paha and Paha. That's our relationship to each other. We are Pahas to each other. And yet my uncle is Naara, and I am his Ara. I am his niece, a man's niece. So that would be Ara. A little different system than English. And you notice quite a few terms work that way in Comanche. In English, brother and sister work that way. And I believe that's about it. I'm trying to think of other reciprocal terms in English. We pretty much have distinctive terms depending on which angle you're looking at a two-way relationship from in English, except for brother. If I have a sister, brother and sister. If I have a sister, she calls me sister, I call her sister. There are many more terms that work that same way in Comanche. Now let's go up a generation here now and say, okay, here's my father and his brothers and sisters, my aunts and uncles. They have parents who are my grandparents. My father's father is called Nakanu. My father's mother is called Nahutsi. So these are grandfather and grandmother respectively. But if you'll notice, going over here onto the mother's side of the family, my mother's father and mother have completely different terms. So there is no one way to say, for instance, grandfather in Comanche. You have to know which grandfather you're talking about, and you have to specify. If it's your father's father, it's your kanu. If it's your mother's father, it's your tok. And these terms, all of these four grandparent terms are also reciprocals. So if there's a man in my life who I call kanu, he calls me kanu right back. My mother's mother, I call tok, she calls me tok right back. So those are two-way relationships as well. And then let's take it up one more generation to the great-grandparent generation. I couldn't quite fit in my chart here. But my paternal grandfather's parents are both called Sa. My paternal grandmother's parents are both called Sa. And over here, I'm just kind of indicating that it continues the same on the other side. So all 8 of your great-grandparents are called Sa. And these are also reciprocal terms. If I talk to my great-grandfather and call him Nutsa, he calls me Nutsa as well, because that's the nature of the relationship between the two of us. So now we've gone up the generations. Let's go over here. Let's say I marry a man. That would be called my husband in English. The Comanche word is kumap. If you're a man and you marry a woman, your wife is called Nkwaha. And let's say we have children, say a son and a daughter. I only put one example of each because we only have the 2 terms. Any son that we have would be called Tua, Natua, Narua, actually. And any daughter would be called Peta. So I say Napeta, my daughter. So that's some of the interesting aspects of Comanche kinship. And I want to show 2 more examples if we don't run out of time. Let's look at some Ponca terms next. Let me take this page off. Now, I'm no expert at all on Ponca, and I haven't made a specific study of this, but the terms that I have come across, and I hope these are all correct. It gets very confusing when you try to ask people these terms and make sure you're looking at the same referent. I hope it does come across, though, that the system is organized not only differently than English is organized, but also quite differently from the way Comanche is organized. Here I'm using the red to represent where, here we have ego is a woman again, I marry a man, my brothers and sisters, my parents and their generation, my grandparents, my kids, and their kids. That's what I'm showing here for the Ponca. The red, or the black, represents a woman's term for these various relatives. The red here, where I've written in an alternate term in red, this represents how the term would differ if ego were male. If I were a man, I would have different terms for some of my relatives than I do being a woman. So let's start here on my own generation. I'm a woman. I have, let's say, older and younger brothers and sisters. And this is another language where you have to know whether the brother or sister is older or younger than the person referring to them in order to use the correct term. There's no cover term that just means my brother. My older brother is called Witinu. My older sister is Wihe Wijante. My younger brother would be Wishonga, and my younger sister would be Witonge. If I were a man, there are alternate terms for some of these. If some of you know Ponca people, you may have heard men call each other Kage. The we on this, it's kind of like the na I was using in Comanche. Some of these terms I've included the we, that's the part that means my. But Kage is the root here that means brother. It's a male term for brother. Let's say I marry a man. He would be my husband, or Egdonge. Egdonge, I believe that's correct. And if we have children, let's say we have a son and a daughter, my son is called Wijinge. This seems to be, again, the we is the part really that means my. The jinge is the root, and it looks like it might be related to a word for small, jinga. The term for daughter is only slightly different. It's Wijange. And let's see what else we have here. I've snuck in some nieces and nephews here. Let me see. I didn't have the woman's term for her nephew. This would be like my sister and her husband's offspring. This would be the nephew. The man would call a nephew of that sort Witashkan. I didn't have the woman's term for that relationship. A woman would call her niece Witijan, and a man would call the same person Witujange. Now, going over here, suppose one of our children married, let's say in this kind of situation, our daughter takes a husband, they have children, male and female. All of these children, in other words, all of our grandchildren are called Witushpa. No distinction made at all by gender or age or anything else. They're all Witushpa on that generation. Now, going up, my father is called Dadi. My mother is Nanha. My brother may have sisters and brothers. His older brother would be called Papatonga, which means something like my big father. This is one of the languages where your father's male relatives are considered to be your fathers in some sense as well. But you can specify Papatonga for his older brother, and Papa Jinga or Dadi Jinga. Apparently Papa and Dadi both figure into some of these father terms. Papa Jinga or Dadi Jinga would be my father's younger brother. But it's sort of like saying my father, my big father, and my little father. That's kind of how you're calling your uncles on that side. Your aunts on that side, your brothers, sisters, no matter which age they are just called Timi. Timi, Timi. Now on your mother's side, your mother is Nonha. Her older brother would be called Negi. Her younger brother would be also your Negi. So there's a kind of a mirror image thing going on here. On your father's side, his siblings, if they're male, they're called fathers, big or little. The females are both called the same thing, though. On your mother's side, if they're female, they're also called Mama or Naha. Ponca for the big one, Jinga for the little one. But her male siblings are both called Negi. You don't distinguish them by age. So there's a sort of like-sex thing. The aunt or uncle that goes through a male relative will be called as if he were a father. Through a female relative, it's the female siblings that will be called as if they were a mother. Just a different kind of system. Now going up another generation, your father's and his siblings' parents are your grandfather and grandmother on this side. Witigan, if you're a woman, that's your grandfather on that side. And actually it's the same on the other side. And your grandmother is Wikan or Kanha. There's apparently two terms that are both used there for your grandmother, but it doesn't matter whether it's your grandmother through your father's side or your mother's side. It's the same on both sides. And there are specialized terms for at least some of these that the men use. So that's, again, a pretty interesting system, a little different from Comanche, fairly different, and quite different from English. Let's see if we can get through a few Caddo examples now. Clip this up so you can see. Now, Caddo language spoken out in the area of Binger and surrounding counties. Here's myself. I'm a woman. I have brothers and sisters. We're going to have to go through this one quickly, I think, because we're running a little short of time. Let's see. Oh, I see I left up my brother terms. Well, let's look at the ones that we have here. My younger sister would be Iye Titi, and this little Titi part, a suffix, or I'm not sure if it's a suffix or a separate word, but that means small. It's a kind of diminutive. So that's my little one. Iye Tahe is my older sister. If I marry, my husband is called Nate Pete Waiha, which really just means the one you live with. And if a man marries, he calls his wife the same thing, the one I live with. Anyway, once you have a married couple and they have offspring, the daughter will be called Hanin, and the son also is called Hanin, so you don't distinguish on that generation by gender. And their children will be called, the male ones, Bakinchi, and the female, Ga'anchi, so those are your grandchildren. Going up, you have A'a, your father, and Ina, your mother. And this is another language, it's kind of similar to Ponca here, where your father's brothers are considered your big and little fathers. So A'a is my father's older brother is A'a Haime, that's my uncle, who's my father's older brother. My father's younger brother is also an uncle in English, but we call him A'a Titi, little father, in Caddo. And my mother, similar thing going on over here. Her older brother is called Iba Titi. No, I'm sorry. Her older brother is called Iba Haime, the big Iba. Her younger brother is called Iba Titi, the little Iba. But the women, her women's siblings are called big and little mothers, respectively, depending on whether they're older or younger than her. And if you go up another generation, you don't have much variation here. Just grandfather Ibat versus grandmother Ikat. So, what can we learn from all this? And I have to wrap it up really quickly. This concept that I started with, that we hear people say sometimes, oh, he's my uncle Indian way. I think we found out that an uncle, the idea of uncle in Indian is kind of a false idea, really. It's an oversimplification. Because not all Indian languages treat terms for uncle in the same way. But an awful lot of them do treat uncle and aunt terms differently than English does. So it's an important distinction to make, but it's sort of an oversimplification to say that there's an Indian concept of uncle. There are at least 3 Indian concepts of uncle that we've seen tonight, all represented in Oklahoma. So I'm assuming, and I think this is what people who specialize in this study have come up with, that in fact the different Indian languages of Oklahoma, which use different systems of kinship terminology, are doing this because it corresponds to different social realities in their traditional worlds of the different tribes. And this brings up another point I'd like to make quickly, that is that, which is that, of course, not only the languages are diminishing and, in the worst case, dying out, but cultures also, traditional cultures, are becoming more kind of homogenized with the majority culture. The true traditional ways of doing things, in addition to language, are also dying out these days. So just as the social systems relating to how you deal with your relatives are changing, the language which goes with them are changing. For example, we noticed that there were 4 different terms for grandparent in Comanche. Nowadays, most children, if they know any word for a grandparent in Comanche, they say, for a grandmother, they know the one, which is the maternal grandmother. I think probably that would be the one that they would be more likely to know, since women live longer and maybe they spend more time with their maternal grandmother. But they tend to call both of their grandmothers Kaku, whereas really Kaku is my maternal grandmother and Hootsie is my paternal. So Hootsie is falling out of use, just as probably the distinction between the roles of those 2 types of grandmother is also falling out of use, or the distinction is being lost within the culture. So there's a correspondence again between language and culture. So this is yet another case where knowing a language doesn't just consist of what's in a dictionary or what's in a grammar book. To really know a language and use the proper native terms for kinship, you have to know, you don't just think of an English word and think, oh, what corresponds to that in this language? It's much more complex. You have to be aware of the entire system and how it relates to the culture. To really understand kinship in an Indian language, you need to know the system, both the linguistic system of how the vocabulary is actually organized and the social system of how you relate to different people in your family and outside of your family. So once again, a complete study of a language must include an understanding of the associated culture. Having said all that, I hope I didn't make your head spin too much, and I hope you'll join us next time on Wordpath.
Ana magwana kita wa pene madaone kita na hene yo hene ana magwana kita wa pene madaone kita na hene yo hene ana magwana kita wa pene madaone kita na hene yo hene ana magwana kita wa pene ma